Good evening. I'm going to begin again, as I have in previous weeks, with this book, C.G. Jung, Psychological Reflections, a new anthology of his writings, 1905 to 1961, edited by Yolanda Jacobi and R.F.C. Hull. And I'm doing that to give a few minutes for our regular members to join us here on the live stream. And so I'm, from this book then, C.G. Jung, Psychological Reflections, which contains about 500 or 1,000 quotes from Dr. Jung. I'm just going to read a few of these quotes and give us an opportunity to reflect on them. It makes very little difference whether the doctor understands or not, but it makes all the difference whether the patient understands. Understanding should therefore be understanding in the sense of an agreement, which is the fruit of a joint reflection. The danger of a one-sided understanding is that the doctor may judge the dream from the standpoint of a preconceived opinion. His judgment may be in line with orthodox theory. It may even be fundamentally correct, but it will not win the patient's assent. He will not come to an understanding with him, and that is in a practical sense, incorrect. Incorrect because it anticipates and thus cripples the patient's development. The patient, that is to say, does not need to have a truth inculcated into him. If we do that, we only reach his head. He needs far more to grow up to this truth, and in that way, we reach his heart, and the appeal goes deeper and works more powerfully. Now, this relates back to a number of points in Jungian psychology. One of the important ones is that Freud was beginning from a materialistic point of view, and he had a specific idea about what dreams meant. And Freud would say if someone dreamed of a church steeple, Freud would say that is a phallus, but that may not be true at all. And so what is fundamental to everything we're going to talk about tonight is the difference between Freud's material approach and an approach that is relates to the psyche as psyche, not as a physical thing. And it's a fundamental difference that Dr. Jung had between himself and later psychologists. And he actually kvetches later on in this article that we're reading that academic psychologists and the psychology which has taken over the medical field has tried to say that dream interpretation can be a matter of laboratory experiment. And that simply is not the case because each of us is different. Each of us has a different universe of images within our psyche, and certain images can mean entirely different things within our psyche. So you'll hear more about that later on in tonight's discussion. So here's another of the quotations. A dream that is not understood remains a mere occurrence. Understood, it becomes a living experience. So this goes back to a fundamental perspective of Dr. Jung, which is the distinction between logos and eros. And logos says that you can understand things, but Dr. Jung said that you also have to have an experience of something, otherwise it's just meaningless to you. And so if I think back on Paul Simon's song Kodachrome, when I think of all the crap I had to learn in high school, it's amazing I can think at all. was his lyric. And the point is that, at least in my case, and I think it's probably true in a lot of people's cases, I remember very little about what I specifically studied, and I studied in university level for 10 years. Formally, I took 10 years of higher education, and I can remember almost nothing of the specific things that I learned, but I can think of experiences that I had in life and how those things affected me. And for example, I often say that I only learned 3 things in my business school, and none of those were in the classroom. And, these were based on personal experiences and not on specific classroom activities, because life is tough, and my business school was tough, and my business school taught me to get through tough times, and so that was good, but it wasn't, I learned that not from any lessons. And so I'll give you some examples. 3 things I learned from business school. Okay, number 1 was we had to do an essay my first year on microeconomics. And I was already a practicing lawyer. I thought I was pretty smart. I thought I could write. I thought I had everything under control. And so I wrote this essay, and I turned it in, and I was so proud of it. And when I got it back the following week, it was a D. And I was just rocked back on my self. I had no idea why I got a D. And so during the break, I was out in the hall, and one of the professors, Cliff Smith, came by me, saw that I was shaken, asked me what was wrong, and I said, well, I got this D, and I have no idea why. And he said, give me that. He grabbed my paper, and he took me into his office. He read through it, and he just started to laugh, and he said, well, you got a D because the class is microeconomics, and you wrote your paper like a lawyer, not like an economist. And so then he proceeded to explain to me how the cost-benefits analysis works in microeconomics, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with money. And so I learned that one pretty well. The second time, in the second year, we had a very, very difficult finance exam. And again, this was Cliff Smith, except he was the professor this time. And after the exam, an older fellow who had been in my class came out, and he was really upset, and he started to rip Cliff right up one side and down the other, how this was an unfair exam and too hard, and it shouldn't have been what it was. And so the result was Cliff said, hey man, if it wasn't tough, it wouldn't be worth anything. And, you know, that was a fundamental lesson from business school, which is it has to be tough in order for us to learn the lessons of how we have to deal with things. And one other lesson I got from business school came from a man who I had learned primary gunnery from in the Marine Corps. He had been a first lieutenant in the Marines when I was a second lieutenant. He was just come back from Vietnam when I was training as an artillery officer. And so he was my professor at Fort Sill, but when I found him at Rochester, he was the Naval Reserve Officer Training Corps officer, and he was a major in the Marine Corps. It happened that by that time I too was a major, so we were both majors, and he was 1 year ahead of me in the business school program. And I went out to lunch with him before I started, and I said, well, Jack, why are you doing this? You're a career Marine officer. Why would you take this business course? And he looks me right in the eye and he says, so that now nobody can bullshit me. and that was the point, which is that after you've taken 15 courses in statistics, nobody's going to pull the wool over your eyes on statistics. And so that was a good lesson to have also. But these lessons come from experience. They don't come from specific learning. They can't be predicted and done in the laboratory. So the point is that you have to have both logos and eros, which is you have to have all the rules and all the methodologies, but then you also have to have experience and what does this really mean. And as you'll hear later on in this discussion tonight, Dr. Jung was really railing 100 years ago against people who wouldn't give psychology or the psyche, a chance. And so anyway, I'm going to begin on paragraph 508, and we are working tonight again, and I think this will be the last time for this group until we change the subject. But this is our 5th session on dreams, and we will we'll finish off this because we're going to finish off this essay tonight that we're talking about. And we're talking about the essay in this book. The book is C.G. Jung Dreams, with a foreword by Sonu Shamdasani. And this is a book that contains 5 or 6 of Dr. Jung's primary essays on dreams. The one we've been talking about for the last 4 weeks is General Aspects of Dream Psychology. And so if you missed those earlier sessions, you can find them in the JRG3 playlist, and then you can bring yourself up to date. And so I'm going to begin tonight with paragraph 508. And one of the key things that we're talking about tonight is the idea of projections. And we say what Dr. Jung says in paragraph 508 is that a naive person, like a primitive, is relatively uncritical about dreams. But the dream it fashions itself from a complex. So in other words, a dream comes up into your psyche and it uses whatever images it thinks you have in your personal unconscious. And sometimes those images are very meaningful, and sometimes they're less meaningful. It's fairly rare for them to mean something specific, like a church spire means a phallus, for example. I mean, Freud wanted to take everything back to sexuality and wish fulfillment, and Dr. Jung believed that a dream was far more than that. And the way I synopsize it as a layman is dreams and visions are messages from your unconscious self that it thinks you need to know, in the sense that everything that happens in your body unconsciously happens for a reason. And so your lung cells regenerate for 70 to 100 years, and so do your heart cells, and your heart keeps beating, and your unconscious tells you when your heart when to beat 72 times a minute, and your lungs when to breathe 12 times a minute. And all your cells in your body, except maybe your bones, regenerate every 7th year. So after 7 years, you're a completely different physical person than you were 7 years ago. And all those things happen unconsciously. But there's some things that come in through your conscious awareness and your consciousness that interact with your unconscious, and then your unconscious reacts to those things and sends you a message. And they may be a message that you require today, it may be an immediate message, but anyway, it comes up as a message. And so one of Dr. Jung's points here is that subjective factors that are peculiar to the subject, and they often have little to do with a real object. So in other words, the subject is you, your internal self, and the object is something that you're referring to, whatever it is outside yourself. And the factors that are in you, you probably have very different experiences than I have, for example. And therefore, the images that you have in your psyche would be very different. And so even if your psyche wanted to say to you, be afraid of the water, let's say, and bring to your consciousness the fact that you have a fear of water. For you, that fear may have come from the idea that there's a whole ocean out there. And for me, that fear might have come from a raging rapid that I saw one day, or I got out into and then I was unable to get back to shore, or something like that. So that made me fearful, whereas for someone else, maybe the ocean made them fearful because they went out in the waves and got pulled out in an undertow, and their life was threatened, and maybe they were saved, but then their psyche is ever after, when it wants to warn them about water, it's going to give them that image of being in the waves, whereas my psyche might give me the image of almost being swept away in a torrent, in a rapids. So that would be the type of thing that we're talking about. Now, the Freudian school says that a dream is unreal or symbolical, and therefore he says that a dream can have these specific meanings, like anything that is a container would symbolize a womb, for example, whereas anything that's like a pen or a church spire or anything like that would symbolize a phallus. Well, you know, we may think of sex a lot, but but it doesn't work that way. So as Dr. Jung puts it in paragraph 509 now, a dream is a theater in which the dreamer himself is himself the scene, the player, the prompter, the producer, the author, the public, and the critic. So in other words, everything that is in a dream is you. It's an image that has come from within you, and it somehow relates to your situation. And it's a interpretation that's going on in the subjective level, in other words, in your unconscious level. And all the figures of the dream are personified features of the dreamer's own personality. So suppose that you dream that you're in a room and that room has green walls, then the fact of that greenness of the walls is something about you, and you have some connection to that greenness, and so that's why the dream gives you that dream. Now, I'm wondering if we're connected, so I'm going to ask whoever is online to just say hello, and please confirm that you are hearing me. If you are online, please say hello. Okay. That's just to see if the chat is working and that everything is functioning on this session. Okay, going on. Paragraph 510, then. This view of Dr. Jung aroused a lot of resistance, and so it's important to understand this subjective-objective significance. And a dream may substitute something for something else. In other words, it may not have a good image for a pen, let's say. And so it may substitute something else. It could substitute a pencil, for example. And what Dr. Jung says here is that if the dream can substitute something, then it may not be so important. Okay. Paragraphs 511 to 513 relate to a specific legal issue that Dr. Jung was having, and I'm not going to get into that in detail. If you want to read about that, I urge you to buy the book, C.G. Jung Dreams. This is the book I'm working with tonight, with the foreword by Sonu Shamdasani. And I would recommend that you just read about that legal issue that he was having. Now, in paragraph 514, Dr. Jung says very clearly that he's not interested in showing a dream is wish fulfillment. This was an explicit part of his break with Dr. Freud. And this essay was first written about between 1912 and 1916, at the time that their relationship was breaking up. And what he also says is that a dream may show what kind of a mistake you're making. So it may react to something you're doing and saying, whoa there, Buster, you may be making a mistake here. And so it gives you the opportunity to correct your attitude. And that can only happen with interpretation of the subjective level. In other words, you have to try to remember your dreams. You have to try to write them down so that you don't forget them, and then think about what the message is that it's trying to send you. And the observation I would make is that if you don't do that interpretation, then the psyche will just keep doing what it does. And so tomorrow it'll present something else to you, and that may or may not be on the same topic. It can keep presenting the same issues for days or weeks, depending on how important your unconscious thinks it is. And it's only over when it's over. So if ultimately your psyche decides that this isn't important anymore, it'll go on to something else. So anyway. So then Dr. Jung is talking about the fact that the transference may enter the problem, and the analyst must make a judgment if he is the patient's real problem. In other words, sometimes in an analytical session, and we're not going to get into that very deeply, but sometimes the analyst starts to present things to the analysand that causes a real issue and causes projection and withdrawal of projections and that sort of thing. And that's largely covered in detail in this book, 2 essays on analytical psychology, which is volume 7 of the Collected Works of C.G. Jung. And that's a very excellent book. I highly recommend it to you. Now, what happens in analysis, and I'm here talking about how I, as a layman, deal with my dreams, and I'm not a mental health professional, and so it could be that you have issues that are deeper than I can possibly address here at a layman's point of view. But in paragraph 516, Dr. Jung points out that analysts go quite deep into the subjective level, and I'm not qualified to do that, and I'm not doing it. And as you know, I resist interpreting other people's dreams. I sometimes interpret my own dreams from my perspective, but it's entirely possible that if I had a professional analyst talking to me about my dreams, that we would get even deeper. But one of the things that Dr. Jung talks about in this paragraph 516 is that we have to beware of wartime images. And I would say that this also relates to any sort of very intense emotional conflict, that we tend to accuse our enemy of our own faults by projection. This is the blame game, and we hear a lot of that in our political environment today, where some politician will blame the other politician for this or that. And if you hear a blame like that, then you have to consider whether what that politician is blaming is really within his own psyche and within his own, let's say, guilt or something like that. Because what the psyche does is it tries to get guilt off its chest. It tries to put it over on someone else. So when you blame someone else, then you've put this problem over on that other person, and you haven't looked at it in your own self. And so whenever you hear the blame game going on, you really have to start thinking about whether that that accusation really applies to the person who's doing the blaming. And we get to the point where we even want to improve and educate the other. Our mentality is still so primitive. So what Dr. Jung is saying is the primitives have a minimum of self-awareness, and so they aren't aware that this issue is within them. And so they tend to, they tend to try to improve other people, and rather than to change themselves. And also we get an issue of maximum attachment to the object, and so an object can exercise a direct magical compulsion. For example, you have a special rock that you keep in your pocket, and it compels you to have it with you all the time. And if you don't have it with you, then you're not protected by your some sort of special magic. That sort of thing. It could be a rabbit's foot, it could be something else. But those can be kind of magical compulsions. And so we need to develop our self-awareness gradually out of our initial state of identity with things, and our self-awareness is well behind our actual knowledge. And so, okay, going on. Paragraph 517. Unfavorable projections usually settle outside our circle of intimate relations. And so when we have something that is unfavorable in our psyche, we actually push those things outside of our close relationships. And but someone who's neurotic can't prevent unfavorable projections from following him home, and that can arouse conflicts at home. So if there's something going on with the man of the house, for example, in his business life, I think a lot of times that used to cause abuse of women, and it aroused conflicts with women and injuries to women. And it typically wasn't the wife that was the problem. It was something at work, but the man had to get it out of himself. And now that's a neurosis, and obviously now we have laws against spousal abuse and that sort of thing. What Dr. Jung is adding in this paragraph 517 is that normal persons can make the same projections, but they are better distributed. And so, maybe a normal person can rethink those sorts of behaviors at home. And what happens is that favorable projections tend to stay close at hand, while unfavorable ones get pushed out to a distance and outside the immediate family. But for a primitive, anything strange is considered a hostile event. And so if we look at our political life, if we see someone in our society who's wearing a little different style of clothes than what we're used to, for example, and you have a primitive reaction to that, then you might consider that as hostile or evil, when in fact there's nothing hostile or evil about it. It's just a different culture that you're seeing. And Dr. Jung is talking about war psychology, where because he was writing this during World War I, and in war psychology, he says, the center of all iniquity is invariably found to lie a few miles behind the enemy lines. They're the bad ones. And invariably we tend to dehumanize them. So in my day, when the Vietnam War was on, I say we, but not I, but others in my groups sometimes refer to our enemies as gooks, and in the Middle Eastern wars, we have people referring to the enemy as towel heads or something like that. And those are obviously dehumanizing ways of referring to an enemy. They aren't necessary, they're pejorative and not appropriate. But anyway, so we can have better relations with our fellows, but only if they live up to our expectations. Unless they become willing carriers of our projections. So that's the problem, is that we think that they ought to behave the way we do, and they don't necessarily. And so that sometimes that causes a damming up of libido, and negative projections become increasingly conscious. And so the quote is, if everybody else did it, how much better the world would be, but to do it oneself, how intolerable. So, if we look around, if we happen to live in the United States, if we look around, we find out that, pretty much 99.99% of the time, we have no problems in our society, even though we have people from every national origin, religion, racial group, whatever. And so, we can see that there's no real problem. But sometimes when something happens, like 9/11 happens, then we apply a negative attitude to everyone, and or everyone that matches a certain description. And in paragraph 518 then, and one of the things about this essay is that it gradually devolves away from dreams and into some of the more general ideas of Jungian psychology. But anyway, I'm going to continue. In 518, paragraph 518, Dr. Jung says that the neurotic acts out his psychic disturbances socially and politically. And so they become a mass psychosis, like wars or revolutions. And it gives neurotic societies someone to foist off on. And it's an enormous relief to one's conscience. Now, I'm wondering whether this is operating properly tonight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the stream for 30 seconds and then resume it, because usually I'm having more people join us than have done so far. So I'm going to stop the stream for 30 seconds and then resume it. I apologize for any inconvenience. Okay, I'm back, and we will continue on. So in paragraph 519, then, Dr. Jung is saying that the more emotional something becomes, the more it gets projected. And so for primitives, it can be projected into inanimate objects. So a primitive would see, a rock or a tree as his enemy, perhaps. And one of the issues about projections is that all projections provoke counter projections. And so that's not necessarily good. And then he starts to talk about transference and countertransference. Now, I don't propose to get into transference and countertransference in any great detail tonight, because that is a huge area of Jungian psychology. A major part of his collected works covers this issue. But let me describe how it plays out in my life, because we often think of let's say, an in-law, like a mother-in-law. Wives often feel that they're in competition with their mother-in-law, for example. But in my case, both of my mother and father have now died, and I still have my mother-in-law with us, thankfully. And what I've found is that my sentiments that are typically sentiments that are a son relating to his own mother have now transferred to my mother-in-law, so that I now feel like she is my mother, although she's not my biological mother, and I obviously still have very warm thoughts about my own mother. But I find that my own sentiments about her are very similar to the sentiments I had about my own mother during her lifetime. But sometimes these transferences and countertransferences can create abnormal and untenable relationships which aim at their own destruction. And I asked the question, how did mom and dad get to be so smart? And in teenage years, we often find, especially daughters, but it happens with sons as well, where there are conflicts between the parent and the child, and if they remain unconscious, there can be a problem. And so it's best to talk these things out with your kids. I know that in my case, when I was a teenager, I wanted a motorcycle, and all my young friends had motorcycles, and I didn't understand why I could not have. And in the fullness of time, I realized that my parents probably couldn't afford to support me in a motorcycle at that time. But at the time that I was denied that privilege, it felt pretty negative to me. And so, you know, I was projecting negative ideas out on my parents, my father and mother. And I really got ripped when I left. I was living in Japan at that time when I was a senior in high school. And I was really ripped when I left Japan. And 3 weeks after I left, my mother bought a motorcycle for my brother and my father, which they used for the rest of their time in Japan. So I was very upset about that. But sometimes a projection that is still has a purely subjective significance in practice, and it can recoil on the subject. So, for example, last night when Andy Gillum and Ron DeSantis were having their debate on CNN, DeSantis had made a number of at least racial innuendos, and Andy Gillum handled it pretty well, I thought, because he said, well, you know, I was born black and I'm black now and I'll probably die black and I can't change the color of my skin. And so I think that his handling of that projected it and recoiled the projection back on DeSantis, but who knows? And so it remains unconscious if it corresponds to the actual behavior of the object. So if in turn Andy Gillum had gotten into a big discussion of racial subjects, that wouldn't have been good, but he handled it pretty well. So anyway, and then sometimes in paragraph 522 now, sometimes the death of an object will cause will have a unconscious effect. So I give you the example of JFK's death. The unconscious imago, which no longer has an object to correspond to it, becomes a ghost and now exerts influences on the subject which cannot be distinguished from psychic phenomena. So, in other words, JFK's ghost, in this case, has a autonomous existence of the object imagos in the unconscious, and it can never be consciously differentiated from the object. So, in other words, the Republican Party has been running against JFK. You hear his name or his initials come up all the time in political debate, even though he's been dead now for 55 years. And so his ghost is an unconscious imago that's playing on in the unconscious of the American psyche. And so in paragraph 523 then, advances in conceptual achievement of mankind are advances in self-awareness. So in other words, if somebody who was politically oriented suddenly became aware that they're allowing JFK's ghost to get their goat, then maybe there can be a conceptual achievement and an advance of self-awareness that can get them away from mentioning JFK. I mean, JFK is obviously not very important any longer, although he gets TV time every year. And Jung says, overvaluation of the object is one of the things most liable to prejudice the development of the subject. So, in other words, anyone who is overvaluing the JFK name may not be developing themselves. And what he says is that if you overvalue, then you're thwarting an attempt at individual differentiation. You haven't differentiated yourself. And at the same time, if you're using JFK's name in a positive sense, again, you haven't differentiated yourself. And in paragraph 524, we demand of ourselves what we demand of others. And so in self-awareness, we have to do that. And so sometimes if the analyst is interpreting a dream image or interpreting what this ghost might amount to, it might cause one-sidedness. In other words, the analyst may offer something which the psyche of the analysand latches onto, but that may not be a balanced view. I'm wondering, just a second. Okay, I guess we're okay still. Okay. So in paragraph 525, now we start to get into some of Dr. Jung's classic complaints about academic psychology and medical psychology as it's practiced. And his first point in paragraph 525 is that psychology is encompassing philosophy and theology. So in other words, what he's saying is that psychology shouldn't be a separate silo in the university, that psychology should encompass both philosophy and theology and many other topics as well. Political science and sociology would be immediate examples, but neurology would be another area. But unfortunately, we haven't been able to break out of these academic silos. And one of the observations in this series, in this Jung's Red Book for Our Time series, is that one of our problems in the world is that we've sliced and diced down everything into a materialistic, simplified way of looking at things. And so this is really covered in detail in the essay of Susan Rowland, which I put on the YouTube channel the other day under the name Breaking Out of Academic Silos. But she talks about a transdisciplinary approach as opposed to a scientific method approach. And she points out that in the traditional scientific method approach, the assumptions are these: a universe is governed by mathematical laws. 2, these laws can be discovered by scientific experiment. And 3, such experiments, if valid, can be perfectly replicated. So that's the so-called scientific method. But a man named Basarab Nicolescu, who's a professor at the State University of New York, wrote a book called Modernity and Cosmodernity. And his fundamental principles are that we have layers of existence. He happens to be a quantum physicist, and his point is that there are layers of reality, and we need to start being able to understand things in their layers because they exist simultaneously. It's something like this idea that light can be both a wave or a particle, but it depends on the observer, and it can't be both. That was actually apparently proven wrong recently when someone made a picture of a light wave that shows particles coming through it too. But it's a start, because everything in our lives is on so many different levels. I mean, just imagine the cell phone waves that are going through your head at this very moment, okay, because every cell phone in your immediate vicinity, and there might be 1,000 of them, every one of them has a different wavelength, and it's sending and receiving waves all the time. And so all those things are going on at different levels, and we have to start to understand those things. And so anyway, Nicolescu's fundamental principles are these. One, the ontological axiom. There are in nature and in our knowledge of nature different levels of reality and correspondingly different levels of perception. Two, the logical axiom. The passage from one level of reality to another is ensured by the logic of an included middle. So there's this and that, and there's something in between. And thirdly, the complexity axiom. The structure of the totality of levels of reality or perception is a complex structure. Every level is what it is because all levels exist at the same time. And so I think that that's a very important concept, and it's a very important concept for Jungian psychology, because we have to understand that so many different things are happening in our psyche all the time. And so anyway, then in paragraph 526, we have to deal with the practical necessities. In other words, from an analyst's point of view, and if you're analyzing your own psyche, you have to recognize that the boundaries are blurred. There are no discrete silos as there are in Western universities these days. And one of the editors of Jung's Red Book for Our Time observed that because of the silos that have been created in ideas between history and political science and psychology and so on, maybe nothing revelatory will come out of our modern universities, and we really need to learn how to blur the lines between these various topics. And so Dr. Jung's point is that it's a problem that medical psychology holds aloof from theology because it's quite apparent that there are psychogenic neuroses, and that those may have some religious construct involved with them. As I've discussed on several occasions, I had an experience of a psychogenic visit by Mephistopheles. Now, this is a Mephistopheles image that I had in my psyche from what I was imagining when I read Goethe's Faust. And so I know it came from my psyche. It didn't come from outside. It wasn't some creature that came down and sat next to me. And so, but medical psychology wouldn't give that the time of day. And what Dr. Jung's complaint is that they try to practice their art in a routine manner, and they say, don't think, act, which prevents thinking and prevents analysis. And so they tend to want to give you drugs for depression rather than trying to understand at depth what's causing the depression. And so they're handing out prescriptions and mechanically applying methods, which don't necessarily resolve the situation. And so he's observing that in 1916, and obviously he would not be happier today with the situation. In paragraph 527, we can expect to find in dreams everything that has been of significance in the life of humanity. So Dr. Jung's point is that we have in our psyche things that perhaps we never experienced personally. I've given an example of a dream I had when I was 6 years old that involved a dinosaur that I had never seen. I had never had an image of it, but nonetheless, I had a dream that had this dinosaur in it. And in the fullness of time now, I have seen that such dinosaurs did exist because I see them in the Museum of Natural History and in books about dinosaurs, for example. But when I was 6, I had never seen such things. And so that image came from something that was very old in the development of humanity, and it actually predated human beings, at least in my opinion. Okay, another point that he makes in paragraph 528 is that the ideas of the moral order and of God belong to an ineradicable substrate of the human soul. So his point is that when Moses came off the mountain with the 10 Commandments, people pretty much knew that those were the moral laws before he did that. The difference is that he came off the mountain with the tablets written in stone, which hadn't been written in stone before, and therefore they became the logos, as opposed to everybody doing it on kind of a eros, loosey-goosey type basis before that. And so then religion at that time in the tradition of early Jews, which was Moses was about 1200 BCE, 1200 years before the Christian era. From that time, Jews were using the law as the basis of their religion, and it was only when Christ came along that belief became a basis for the religion, for Christianity, which Christianity was actually a Jewish heresy that became bigger than Judaism itself. So anyway, what Dr. Jung is saying is that any honest psychology must come to terms with these ideas of the moral order, whether you call them the Ten Commandments or something else. Psychology has to come to terms with them. And psychologists also have to reckon with the God image, because the God image is a definite complex of psychological facts in the deep unconscious. It's the self, it's the deepest archetype in the unconscious, and all of us have it there, whether we're atheists or not. And and he says this is just as it must deal with instinct. Psychology, it's just as psychology must deal with instinct without being able to say really what the instinct is. And so finally in paragraph 529, he says, dream analysis is instrumental to analytical treatment, and it allows the analyst, whether it's you writing down your dreams and trying to work out what they mean, or whether you're working with a professional analyst, they're allowing you to deal with a very complex question. And it's the psyche as it really is. It's not laboratory experiments. And so this is where this essay by Susan Rowland comes in, breaking out of academic silos, where still a century later, we're trying to put things into neat little bundles in silos in academic departments, and we're not allowing cross-fertilization between psychology, theology, and medicine, for example. And and what Dr. Jung was railing about in 1916, which is still a problem, is that the materialists following Freud can't get over the dogma that mental diseases are diseases of the brain, not of the psyche or the soul. And so they're thinking of them merely as laboratory processes, and it's far more than that. So, one of the things that Dr. Jung said fundamentally was that in Answer to Job, paragraph 752, or actually it's paragraph 751, where he points out that people don't quite understand yet that he believes the psyche is real. And if you have dreams, then you have to believe that the psyche is real too. And if the psyche is real, then we have to understand something about it. And it isn't governed by physical facts, by laboratory experiments that can be controlled in that way. That's why this idea of Mr. Nicolescu, that we have to understand complexity and how things interact with one another. And okay, and so finally, Dr. Jung says we have to think of psychic process as psychic and not as organic cell process. So the things that are happening in your psyche, in your dream life, for example, that isn't coming from the chemicals that are running around in your brain. That's coming from psychic process, which is not material, which you can experience, and which, if you've ever had a dream, then you certainly have experienced it. But it couldn't be predicted in a laboratory process, no matter how long we work on it, because it's not material, it's psychic. And so anyway, for reasons which I don't understand, I haven't gotten many followers onto this session this evening, and usually I have quite a number by this time, and so I am suspecting that there may be some problem with the live stream feed this evening, and because I haven't had any interaction with anyone on the chat, I'm going to go ahead and terminate this session unless anyone has, in the next 30 seconds or so, anyone wants to bring up any comments or thoughts about this, and I will work on what our next topic for next week will be. And meanwhile, if I do have a problem, I am recording this session, so I will still be able to upload videos of the session, even if there's been some technical problem in the YouTube live stream, which seems to be the case possibly this evening. So anyway, thank you for joining me, for those that did join this evening, and I'm sorry we haven't had a better interaction tonight, and I hope that we can have in future sessions, but I need to look into what the technical issues are and what might be causing this issue. So anyway, thank you for joining me this evening. I'll be back next Monday evening at 8 p.m. And for the advanced reading group, we will be having our regular session on Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Zoom, as usual. So thank you again for joining me this evening. And,